Well, thanks very much, Jane. And now I can say, wearing my other hat, how delighted I am and very flattered and honoured to be asked to give this lecture, and indeed that the Women of the Year has chosen to do it in the Royal Institution, and to thank Barclays as well for their sponsorship. What I discussed with Joan was what to talk about, and an obvious thing to have talked about would have been something very clearly focusing on women, women in science. But as we talked it through, it seemed that that is the kind of story that's already been told. It's the kind of issues that are not particularly controversial, although they are, of course, still problems. And that what you might prefer to hear about is something that does concern women, because we are, of course, citizens of the 21st century. Many have children. And what we thought would be better would be to actually explore a much more controversial issue, and that is what the impact of current technologies and future technologies will be having on the mind of the 21st century child. You might argue, is that what your children are going to be looking like? Some kind of robotics. This is, I think, of concern at the moment, and there's been a huge amount of attention on this, partly because people fear there is something there, but at the same time there's not lots of evidence. We don't know whether it's good or bad. We don't know quite what we want, and it does touch on the very essence, really, of the point of being alive in the 21st century. As we think about our humanity and what it means to be a human being, and I'll come to that in a moment, and whether we're in danger because of the technology of becoming kind of dysfunctional robotic nerds with evil grins, perhaps even bent on some kind of world domination of some sort. Yeah, as scientists. This is how I think people see scientists anyway, actually, like this. That is to say, creatures devoid of any emotion, any romance, any heart, sort of cold, calculating beings who kind of grin like this. Now, of course, this is sort of parody. I quite like that, actually. I just think it's a nice picture. But what we're going to explore is how real that is, what it is that we might be losing, what human nature might be, and what neuroscience, my area, what we can bring to the party, we neuroscientists. So let's start then. If we're going to look at the brain of the future and innovation, we're going to look at the brain, then we're going to look at the future, and then guess what? We're going to look at the 21st century child. So very simple, step-by-step progression towards, I think, one of the biggest questions that we can be asking, not just scientists, but anyone who's caring about where we're headed. So let's think first about the brain. And I do apologize if I'm getting rather technical on you at this late stage in the day when perhaps you're really getting quite thirsty by now, and don't really want to hear a load of, you might imagine, jargonistic science. I'll try and keep that to a minimum, but I think we just need to set the stage because I imagine most people here are not neuroscientists. Is that right? Hands up, neuroscientists. Come on, declare yourself. There's one. Yeah, they always kind of lurk and not you think there's none there until the question and answer, and then you get this highly technical. What Blogs and Blogs showed in 2002. Anyway, so for those of you, the majority of you, who tell me you're not neuroscientists, this is the brain, sideways on. And I like showing it like that because it does show you just how banal and at the same time how spectacular it is. Because when you think about it, there it is in the same universe as nasal hair or earwax or saliva. It's a sludgy thing. And certainly when I dissected a human brain when I was at Oxford, I did wonder, as you roll up your sleeves and you put your hand into this Tupperware pot, you wear gloves, of course, because the thing's in a kind of fixative that keeps it firm. I wondered if I got a bit under my fingernails. Yeah. When I said that once at school, someone actually did throw up, actually. But, if you got a bit under your fingernails, would that be the bit that somebody loved with? Would it be a memory? How do you go from moi, this wonderful, insubstantial consciousness and sensitivity, moi, to that? I mean, it's remarkable. So anyway, let's look first at what, we're going to have a quick crash course on the brain now. The first thing that, especially nowadays, people tend to ask is moi all in the genes? Sometimes you think that might be the case because there's so much hype on genes, and there's been a great shift since the mapping of the genome, onto almost the assumption that everything is trapped inside the strands of DNA. And I just want to dismiss that idea with just one, I think, very clear and very good experiment. This is a healthy brain. Well, it's not healthy anymore. The person's dead, but they were healthy once. And compare it with this brain, and you can see that the cavities are much enlarged due to the atrophy of the tissue either side. Now, this person had had a disease I'm sure you've all heard of called Huntington's chorea. Huntington's chorea, named after the Greek for dance, because the patient presents with wild, involuntary flinging of the limbs in a grotesque caricature of a dance. The reason I'm suddenly talking to you about Huntington's chorea is because it featured in this ingenious study, and it did so because, unlike most other brain disorders, Huntington's chorea does relate to one gene only, one rogue gene. If you have the bad gene, you get Huntington's chorea. That's the end of it. So here, could it be that everything is indeed all in the genes? Now, what I want to show you is even here, the genes don't set totally the agenda. And therefore, you can't assume that elsewhere it will do the same thing. So this is the study. It's a while ago now, 9 years ago. And what they did was to take mice and to deliberately tweak the genes of the mice so they had the mouse equivalent of Huntington's chorea. Because it's a movement disorder, even though it's in a mouse, you can still evaluate the degree of impairment because you can give the mice little movements to do, little motor tasks, and you can score them. And in this particular experiment, the higher the score, the worse was the movement. So you might wonder why they were doing this. They were doing it because they were asking a really interesting question. Can nurture impact on nature? Can even here the environment make a difference to the genetic destiny of a mouse? So one group were kept in a simple standard lab environment. The others were in a so-called enriched environment. Now, enriched for a mouse doesn't mean that they come to the Royal Institution, take up membership at £90 a year, incidentally, use all the facilities, come and kind of hear science lectures. No, for them, enrichment are little ladders and wheels and so on in a larger cage, as you can see here. That's all. That's all. Now, what we're going to look at is, did this environment make a difference to the movements of the mice? You can probably guess the answer. I wouldn't be setting this up if it didn't. Yeah. So here, as always in science, you have the control group, that's to say the mice who had not had any tampering of their genes. And because they're perfectly normal mice, they don't have the movement problems. And as they're aging, as you can see on the horizontal scale, so indeed they're living out their mousy lives with no problem. Compared to their counterparts here, who are in standard housing, and they are living out their genetic destiny, as you can see by the vertical scale, which shows the score which reflects the impairment in movement. The higher the score, the worse the movement. And as they are aging, so their movements are getting worse, as with humans. Now, what about the guys who were in the enriched environment, who were genetic identical to those that green line? What about them? The only difference was they were exposed to ladders and wheels and so on. Look at them. Yeah, so the age of onset is much later. The degree of impairment is much more modest. So my point is that, yes, of course, genes are necessary. I don't want to, if there's press, I don't want to say Baroness says genes don't matter anymore. Of course they do. But rather like Steve Jones has said, I think in the press a day or two ago, that yes, they are necessary, but they are not sufficient, and that's the difference. Genes are vital. If they go wrong, like the sparking plug in your car goes wrong, your car will be messed up. But that does not mean to say that's all there is to it. Genes are part of a highly complex system of nested hierarchies of proteins and neuronal networks and circuitry and a whole manner of beauty and complexity that then gives you the holistic brain. There is no one-to-one relationship between a single gene and a complex mental trait, despite what you may hear. I say it's necessary, not sufficient. If it goes wrong, you might have an impairment. That does not mean to say it's the gene for this or that. That's where the false logic has come in. So this kind of whimsical thinking that you could choose your life partner by dialing up their genes and trying to find humor, dependability, understanding, and conversation skills. So hands up any man here who's got that, or anyone who thinks they've found anyone who's got that. Yeah. Clearly she's on to 2.1 by now. I don't know what that is quite doing. Or indeed who think that they might be able to cherry-pick genes for their children in that kind of way, obviously is out of the question. It's just daft.